Hi everyone. Tonight we're going to be talking about escrow holdbacks. And just to start it off, what is an escrow holdback? An escrow holdback is an agreement in real estate transaction where part of the seller's proceeds, or occasionally the buyer's funds, are held in the escrow account after closing, instead of being paid out immediately. The purpose is to make sure that incomplete work, repairs, or obligations are finished after closing. Once the agreed upon conditions are met, such as final repairs, permit sign-offs, or whatever other inspections are needed, then the escrow agent releases those funds to the individual that completed the work. Key thing about escrow holdbacks are they are temporary and usually have some kind of deadline for completion, whether it be 30 or 60 days after closing. If the work isn't done by then, the funds can be used to pay contractors directly, or in some cases forfeited to the buyer. Typically, there's an agreement in place prior to closing that all parties have agreed upon. And to be clear, an escrow holdback has to be first discussed with the buyer and the seller to see if it's even an option. Then go and take that to the title company, discuss it with the escrow officer. And of course, it has to be approved by the lending company because ultimately, what kind of a risk does this impose on the lender? If they go to sell this in the future, which most lending companies do sell the loans, that's kind of how they make their money, then is this loan sellable? Because escrow holdbacks are a huge risk to the lending company. And I had mentioned that some kind of agreement has to be in place before you close. And this agreement should hold the agents, the title company, and the lending company not liable should anything arise after closing, and that this agreement is strictly between the seller and the buyer, and that the buyer and seller have to work together to get the work completed based on the timeline and the work that is outlined in the escrow holdback has to be done prior to the funds being released. So let's go over a real world example. Roof replacements. The buyer and the seller agreed to close on a house, but the seller is in the middle of replacing the roof. The roof work won't be finished before the scheduled closing date. So both sides agreed to close on time. Both sides agreed to close on time. 15,000 of the seller's proceeds are held in an escrow holdback. If the seller completes the roof replacement by the deadline and provides receipts, proof of completion, then the 15,000 is released to the seller. If the seller fails to complete the work, the escrow can release funds to the buyer so they can hire a roofer to finish it. This way, the deal still closes on time and the buyer has financial protection. In the agreement that all parties have agreed to prior to closing, you obviously, if you're representing the buyer, have to protect the buyer in all cases, right? That's what we do. But you have to maybe put in a couple different options. If the roof replacement doesn't get done, you should outline in this agreement that then the buyer has the option to not move forward with that company and choose their own company, that was kind of like what was in the example given. Or maybe there's an option B where those funds are just released to the buyer automatically and the buyer can then do whatever they want with those funds. Whatever it might be, try to have a couple different options if option one isn't available. Maybe, just as an example, maybe the HOA has to get involved in this because maybe the roof replacement has to be done by the HOA or something like that. Typically not the case unless it's a condo or townhome situation. But let's just say the HOA has to be involved. And maybe the HOA isn't going to even approve the work because maybe it goes against their guidelines. I don't know. Just giving an example. So then you have the option B so that the buyer isn't just completely out of luck. everything was agreed upon in the Binzer period and the seller didn't or couldn't get the work done completed before closing, the buyer should not be left hanging because of that. So let's talk about the benefits of doing an escrow holdback. Number one, it keeps the transaction moving. Without a holdback, the closing would need to be delayed until the repairs are finished. This could cause financing issues, especially if there's rate locks expiring, moving plans are interrupted, whatever it might be. Now, let's talk about the rate lock real quick, because if you are needing an escrow holdback and they're in a rate lock, talk to the lender about what those fees look like to extend that rate lock. Typically, it's anywhere from 300 up, depending on the length of time and depending on the lender. But extending the rate lock is an option if the buyer can extend the closing to maybe get the work done before you close. But sometimes that's not always an option. Number two, an escrow holdback protects the buyer. The buyer doesn't have to take the seller's quote unquote word that the work will be completed because these funds are legally reserved, ensuring accountability. And in most escrow holdbacks, those funds have to be allocated for that work outlined in the agreement before closing that the seller and buyer agreed upon, unless there's verbiage in there that then the buyer, if the seller doesn't follow through and get the work done, what happens with those funds? So just kind of keep that in mind. Number three, it's flexibility for unfinished work, especially useful for repairs delayed by weather, permits, material shortages. Let's see, kind of like an exterior paint in the winter. We don't really have that issue here in Arizona, but we could have an issue with weather related in the monsoon season with roof repairs. So if it is monsoon season and maybe we had a big storm come through, microbursts all over the valley, hundreds, thousands of roofs are having to be replaced, and you just can't get on the schedule to get it done before closing, an escrow holdback might be an excellent option for your clients. Fourth benefit, negotiation and compromise. The sellers don't lose a buyer over unfinished work. They're not in default of the agreement because they have both agreed to move forward with closing with the escrow holdback. And the buyers don't lose the home because they're nervous about incomplete work. And fifth, risk mitigation. If the seller walks away and doesn't finish properly, the buyer has access to funds to cover the cost. So 5 benefits of an escrow holdback. Now let's talk about some negatives. Number one is it's not always allowed by the lenders. Many mortgage companies only permit holdbacks for very specific reasons, commonly weather-related repairs. Some lenders may not allow them at all, forcing parties to find another solution. Again, most escrow companies are going to be selling this loan, and they have to make sure that it's number one, sellable, but also they're not going to do a loan on a house where maybe they won't have a roof for a week. Like, where are they going to live? Usually not the case. It can be done in one day. But if it, depending on the work involved, the lender's going to make sure that their client, the buyer, is taken care of and that they are going to be given a home that's livable. Number 2 negative, or second negative, disagreements on completion standards. Well, there's really no one to decide whether the work is done completely or not, or correctly. It's going to be up to the buyer to say if they approve of the work that has been completed. And then at that time, the buyer will talk to the escrow company who will release the funds to the contractors. But the buyer, seller, and escrow may not agree on the work being done correctly or completely, which can cause disputes and delays in releasing of the funds. So just reiterate that this is a risk that the buyer and seller are taking on by doing the escrow holdback, and they have to work together to make sure that everything is done completely and within the specified time frame. There's a cost to doing an escrow holdback. Who's going to pay for that? I guess it depends on the situation. I just ran into a situation where a contractor had 2 months to get this work completed, and they didn't get it completed. And so we were rushing to find a solution, and our solution was to do an escrow holdback. That was at no fault, really, to the buyer, and kind of sort of not to the seller too, because the seller he had hired a contractor, although it is their responsibility to keep up on them to make sure the work is done in a timely manner and before closing. But ultimately it came down to the contractor. So in our situation, the escrow company and lender did put that fee, and I think it was a $350 fee on the seller to pay at closing. So again, there is a fee when it comes to doing an escrow holdback, and that is done at closing. Then you always run into an insufficient coverage of risk, because depending on the lender, and I don't even know if it depends on the lender, this might be every lender or lending company. The max amount that can be held for repairs is $15,000. So what happens if it costs $20,000? Well, who's going to pay for that? The buyer would, because the seller has already done their commitment of $15,000, because again, that's the max that can be held. So the buyer might be left covering the extra $5,000 in this case. So parties have to be careful when they're doing estimate costs when settling a holdback amount. And it might come down to you both agree on a contractor to do the work. The contractor gave you an estimate, let's say for the roof replacement, $22,000. Escrow holdback is only for $15,000. Well, what about that extra $7,000? A solution would be, of course, this has to be agreed upon. The seller could prepay the roofing company $7,000, and then the additional $15,000 to get a total of $22,000 is done through the escrow holdback. That's a solution. Or they just agree to do the $15,000 and pray it doesn't go over. A fourth negative is extended transaction ties. So even though the closing occurs, the file isn't fully finished or wrapped up until the holdback is resolved. And that can linger for weeks. Usually it doesn't go into months, but it could. And keep in mind, our agency with our clients ends when we record. So the agents in the transaction, we have to step back because we can't get involved. Our agency has ended. And you just have to be very careful, and you have to make sure that you've explained this to your client that you're representing, because, oh, and also, again, it's reiterated into the escrow holdback agreement that this is now after closing. I can't get involved. Like, sure, are we always going to be there for them? Sure, like I'll answer the phone, I'll talk to them. But if anything arises from it, I have to say, I'm so sorry. Remember when I mentioned my agency's ended? I cannot be a part of this anymore. It's between you and the buyer and the seller. And that almost sounds kind of rude, because we always want to go above and beyond for our clients. But in this case, agency is ended, but the transaction ties or wrapped up the file, that's mainly lender and title company. As far as us, our agency ended, we're done. So make sure that you definitely have those conversations, because you don't want them to feel like, oh, I've been paid, my part of the deal is done, because that's not we don't want that. So tread lightly on that and just make sure you word it appropriately. And then a sixth negative is there's potential for the seller to give like a pushback. Some sellers don't like escrow holdbacks because it delays receiving their full sale proceeds, which yeah, that's true. Um, but it is a way for them to not be in breach of contract because they didn't do the repairs they agreed to during the Benzer. They're not losing the buyer as long as they agree mutually to an escrow holdback agreement. So yes, there's going to be some sellers that get pushback, but it's not often. I also want to point out that overestimating an escrow holdback is always a good thing to do. And if you're representing the seller, you're going to want to let them know that because sometimes things happen and extra funds are needed. So you want to cushion the holdback a little bit with a max of 15,000. But let them know, like, if the work is completed and there's leftover money, the seller gets that back. That doesn't go back to the buyer unless, of course, it's agreed upon in the escrow holdback. But typically it's not because I guess depending on the situation, if a buyer's already been given 3% seller concession and based on the loan type and the down payment that they've received, maybe they maxed out on their seller concession, which is why they have to do the escrow holdback. They don't get any additional funds. They can't get any more funds per the loan program. So that money goes back to the seller. So just make sure you have that conversation as well, because I think that's a benefit of cushioning the amount of an escrow holdback. Again, a max of 15,000. So bottom line, an escrow holdback, it is a really smart tool to keep a real estate transaction moving with minor and necessary items when minor and necessary items are not complete. But it does come with lender limitations, possible disputes, and the risk of underestimating costs like we had talked about. But I feel like there's more benefits than negatives if you can get it approved by the lender and the escrow company to keep the transaction moving. Our goal is to get the clients the house that they want, right? And it's our goal as the seller's agent to sell the home for our client. So when does this work best? Well, it works best when unfinished work is well defined and it needs to be done after closing. When costs are estimated accurately, make sure you get a couple bids and then have a conversation about, okay, this is how much you should have title hold back. And then both parties agree in writing on who decides when the work is done. Typically, it's the buyer. Typically, it's the buyer. And it's very important to work with an escrow company that has done escrow holdbacks because it is key to having a detailed and defined holdback agreement that all parties can agree to. So real quick, I'm going to share my screen because I want you to see just a basic example of what an escrow holdback agreement looks like. And this is very basic. It's just a template that I found. Whoever your title rep is, they can actually create one that's way more detailed, but oops, I didn't want to share that because it did have, sorry, give me one moment. I'm trying to get my screen back. It did have personal information on it, so I didn't want to get that in class. So this is just a bit, oh, hi, didn't mean to do that. Hold on. Trying to, sorry. Why is this not working? Where did it go? Give me 1 second. Sorry, guys. My mouse isn't working, so I'm trying to do this. My touch screen. Stop share. Well, I don't know why this is not working. Oh, there we go. Okay. So this is a basic template. So it just states it's an escrow holdback agreement. It's got the parties involved, the address, the amount, the purpose of the holdback. It'll have a clear completion date. Um, it'll talk about, who's going to verify the work, and then if there's some kind of default, like the work wasn't completed, what happens, anything miscellaneous, and then all parties agree to it. Now, again, this is a very basic holdback. In my opinion, it should be way more detailed. And your escrow agent can help you create one, and you can work together with the opposite agent to make sure it's worded appropriately for all parties, because each agent is going to make sure that they're protecting their client and their client's interests. And then title may have a separate one that they have to file because, again, when they go to sell the loan, then that person or entity that's purchasing the loan will want to see that there's an escrow holdback. Does anyone have any questions about an escrow holdback? Perfect. All right. Well, that was tonight's class. I hope you got a lot out of it. Again, this will be recorded and uploaded to my YouTube channel at Tina Nerland, where you can go and revisit any of the past classes that have been recorded. If there's any material or anything that you would like more information on, please do not hesitate to reach out to me. I am always available for you. And if you need anything at all, just call, text, or email me. And if you have any class subject recommendations, maybe something that you want to learn a little bit more about, please send me some messages just to say, hey, Tina, could you maybe do a class on this? I would be more than happy to. Thank you so much for coming tonight. Have a great evening. I will talk to y'all later. Bye.